All right, this is Dan Schneider, and this is the second interview with Ed Shiller for the George Dickerson project. Our first one had a few technical issues, so we're not going to redo it, but we're going to just talk a little bit more about George Dickerson and just sort of recap Ed, who he is, and his relationship with George to begin with, and then go on into some other George anecdotes. So, Ed, if you could just briefly recap your relationship with the actor and writer and diplomat George Dickerson.
Well, I first met George, I think it was in January 1958. I was a student, a 10th grade student at the Woodstock Country School, a small co-ed boarding school in Vermont. And George just suddenly appeared on the scene and was a teacher there for about a year per class. And our relationship sort of started on a very rocky footing. I didn't especially like him. In fact, I took an intense dislike of him when I first met him. And I was sort of acting up a lot in his class. And then he did something rather remarkable, which I think shaped our relationship for the next, 57 years. And I think it was something always in his mind, because I heard this story, which I'm about to relate, from his son Sam, just about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago when I was in New York to hear George read his poetry. And this is what it was. I was sitting in his algebra class, acting out as usual, being very disruptive. And George, in a rather calm, non-threatening, non-judgmental way, so just said, "Ed, it looks like you really don't want to be here." And I said I didn't. And he said, "Well, you don't have to be." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You can just leave. You just come back when you want to come back." And I said, "What about David, who was the headmaster? Are you going to tell him?" And he said, no, this is just between you and me." So I sort of walked out of the class, somewhat stunned, I think. And I remember the memory I have, the most vivid memory of that sort of incident, is standing alone in this common room. I guess all the other students must have been out, or I guess we're in class. And thinking, nobody has ever quite treated me this way. I felt in a strange way validated. I could be me, he accepted me, and he was being sort of just open and non-judgmental about it. And I thought, and I said, there's got to be something more to this guy. There's really something valuable there. And I sort of just made a decision that I would suspend my judgment of him, in fact, eliminate the earlier judgment, and just go on and befriend him and see where it developed, which is what I did. And I went back into the class. And this was in Woodstock, Vermont. Then I was there another year or 2 years after that, and he was there for a year and a half. He went to New York, and I would see him when I was in New York, initially on vacations from school. I'm also from New York. And our relationship sort of then flowered, I guess. It was a periodic relationship. When I was living in New York before I went away to university, so that was maybe about a year or two since I knew George, I'd see him fairly regularly. Then my university years, I mostly lost touch with him. I had 1 or 2 contacts with him. And when I came back to New York and started working as a journalist, I renewed my relationship with him, and that lasted until I went away to Europe. Lost contact for several years, and then reestablished it in the late 70s.
In the first interview, you mentioned that you knew 3 of George's 4 wives. His first wife, Lucy, is what her name was at the time, and then you didn't know his second wife. You knew his widow, his 4th wife, Suzanne, and his 3rd wife's name was, I forget.
Was Victoria.
And you and your wife both knew her?
My wife didn't know her. I wasn't married to Rosemary at the time. I think I first met Victoria in 1966. That's when I came back to New York and began working and reestablished my relationship with George. And I really knew her as George's wife. I didn't have a separate relationship with her.
And I remember you had mentioned that you had gotten to know the first wife, Lucy, and her daughter, what was her name? Rachel. for one weekend after she and George had split up, they had come out to visit. I guess it was you and your wife sometime in the 1980s.
No, not my wife. No. This is, I was then,
Oh,
what year was it? It would have been 1960. So I was 18. And it was the summer, and it was just before I was about to begin university in Baltimore. And I was living at my parents' house out in Long Island, on the North Shore. And when I heard, when I was in Europe for the summer, Europe and Israel, and when I came back, one of the first things I did was call George, say hello, and Lucy answered the phone and said that she and George had split up. And my mother suggested that that Lucy and the two kids, he had two daughters, Lisa was the younger one, that they come out to the house in Long Island and get away from the summer heat in New York and have a nice weekend. And so we did, and I guess that probably was the most amount of concentrated time I had spent with her.
Did you ever get to know the mother of George's son, Dome Karakowski, the Finnish filmmaker? I think she was a reporter or a journalist in Finland.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she's now retired. I never got to know her. I never met her. I've known about Dome for several years. The first time I met him was fairly recently. It was last September at the Toronto International Film Festival. He had a film showing there called The Grump, which was a very funny film, a wonderful character study, which Dome said was partly based upon his dad, George.
So you also mentioned that you were a writer. Were you mostly a journalist, or did you do any fiction yourself? And if so, did you ever seek George's opinion on your writing and vice versa?
Okay. Most of my writing initially was as a journalist. I was a journalist for about 15 years. Then I went into public relations. I did some fiction writing. I never showed it to very many people because I don't think it was very good. So I never really pursued that area, and I never showed any of that to George. I've written a couple of books, but they're on public relations, on media relations. And I did try my hand at poetry. I think, oh gosh, it must have been, I probably started maybe about 14, 15 years ago. And I did it for a few years, and it was just light sort of stuff. You know, some of it was not quite so light, but I remember that I showed George maybe 4 or 5 of those poems. And his comment, he was always very direct as a critic, but I think very helpful too, and honest. He said, they're very pleasant poetry, he said, but it's not high art, and that's as far as I got. But I know he took his poetry obviously very seriously. I think during you know, there was a time for well over 2 decades when he had writer's block, but he wrote poetry obviously before that, and I think his poetry after that, a lot of it dealing with his experiences in Lebanon, which I think is what caused the writer's block, and maybe the poetry was a way of him expressing it. And I remember him telling me just recently, probably, I don't know, my sense of time sort of loses as I get older, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about poetry and relationships and so on. And he mentioned that his own sort of progress towards becoming a poet. And he said it was only in recent years that, you know, he remembered he showed some of his later stuff to Leonard Cohen, who was a lifelong friend of his. And Cohen looked at him and said, "George, you finally got it." So for George himself, I think that was his own sense of when he really felt that he had achieved high art in his own poetry.
You mentioned Leonard Cohen. I know one of the things that in my 10, 12 years of talking with George on and off, he'd mentioned a lot of people who were noted in the arts and also politics, and he was sort of a Leonard Zelig kind of figure in that he knew a lot of people in a lot of places. Did you ever get to meet people like Leonard Cohen or some of these other actor friends or writer people that George just had associated with? And in doing so, I just remembered in the first interview, my wife reminded me, he actually, George had told me he knew the wife of, was it, Arthur Miller? Arthur Miller. Yeah, I think Arthur Miller's last wife. I think he was friends with. Did you ever meet her or any of these other
No,
people?
I'm sure he was friends with her because he was good friends with Arthur Miller. I think he met Miller. I might be wrong in this, but through his third wife, Victoria. Um, I met of George's group. The one that I did meet was Leonard Cohen, and that was before Cohen was known at all. This was back at Woodstock, and I think it was in the spring, or it might have been in '58 or the spring of '59. It might have well been '59. But George, we used to go over George's apartment when we were at this co-ed boarding school. George and his first wife Lucy and their kids shared or had an apartment adjacent to the boys' dorm, and a bunch of us would go in there just to chat in the half hour or so when we got to the dorm before lights out. And one day George said, "Ed, make sure you come over tonight, because a very good friend of mine is coming in from Montreal. He's a would-be poet." I think George at the time was probably 25, and Cohen was about 24. And so we went over there to George's apartment that night. There may be 3 or 4 of us students, and then Leonard and Lucy and George. And we just had an hilarious time. The one memory I have of that, the real stark memory of that is we decided that we wanted to, as an activity, to read from a play. And since there were 4 or 5 of us there, we wanted to get different copies of the play so that we wouldn't all have to be poring over the same book. The only play in his library, which is pretty extensive even then, where he had duplicate copies, was of Cyrano de Bergerac. But they, of course, were all different translations. So we would just, a couple of us would sit over one book and a couple over another book and so on, and we'd read a line, and then the other actor would come in with his line. And of course, because of the different translations, there were all these non sequiturs, things just didn't make sense. It was just hilarious. And then we all took turns at that very last scene when Cyrano, I guess, fantasizes, about these enemies because he was hit on the head the day before. And he sort of has this imaginary sword play, which is when he dies, and his last line is, "And my white plume." And I remember all of us practicing that in really absurd ways and just sort of rolling over in paroxysms of laughter. The only other of these people that I met independently of George, and that was Arthur Miller. And this is before I knew that George knew Arthur Miller, though it may have been after he did know him, because it was in 1968. And this is what it was. It was a movie preview, a press preview. I was then working as a slot man or a copy editor supervisor at the New York Times News Service. And so we would get these invitations to press openings of movies, press showings. So I saw this and said, "Oh, I think I want to go to this one," because this was the movie Z, and it was the story of Grigoris Lambrakis. Well, in 1963, I was in Europe. I was in Greece. I met Lambrakis. He was a Greek MP who was murdered turned out by the government. And I had met Lambrakis a month before he was murdered through a Greek friend of mine in London who I knew at university. It's very complicated. In any event, I was working for this organization, a Greek organization, and I got involved with Lambrakis almost when I first arrived, the very first day I arrived in London. I arrived on Good Friday. I had, I think, a total of about $6 in my pocket. I managed to talk my way through customs and immigration. I took a freighter across from New York to Liverpool. And it was Good Friday, and I had nowhere to go, and I really didn't know anybody. I had a letter of introduction to a British MP named Michael Foote, who ran a sort of small newspaper, and it was, to get work there, but I couldn't reach him. So I thought, who do I know? And I remembered my friend John Dragumis. If I'm going on too long about this, let me know, and I'll cut it short. Well, I didn't know really where to get hold of John, except this was the weekend that they had this, I guess, I don't know if they still do, this Aldermaston Peace March, sort of a ban the bomb kind of thing. And I figured John would be on it. So I asked people where this march would be. It was 26 miles leading into London. They said in Maidenhead, so I took what little money I had, hopped on the train, went to Maidenhead, and sure enough, this group of about 10,000 marchers was taking a lunch break. When they finished lunch, I just stood at the beginning of the march, and they all queued by, walked by, and eventually I saw somebody holding up a sign saying, "Hélas." And I went up to the guy and I said, "Do you know John Dragumis?" And then this big hand reaches out, and it was John. So we got to know each other. Well, the person who I had asked was this guy Lambrikis, who was then murdered a month later. Well, in a funny way, I got involved in that because this organization that I worked for was contacted when Lambrikis was first attacked. He was run down by a motorcycle and sidecar. And they wanted us to get a brain surgeon in from Scotland to go and operate on an emergency. And so I arranged the passage of this guy. And in fact, that incident was in the movie. They called him Professor Dodd in the movie. His name was Dot in real life. So anyway, so I got him off to Athens, and then Lambrikis died. And then John asked me, he said he got a letter from some group, non-identified, saying, "We killed Lambrikis, now we're going to go after you." And that's because John himself and his family were very political in Greek politics, very active in Greek politics. So John sent me over to Athens for a week to find out. I really met a lot of interesting people. In any event, 5 years later, when this movie is made, I went to this preview, and Arthur Miller was there. And for some, I forget how I got there, but myself and this a woman who was very active in the Greek community in New York at the time, and Miller sort of walked out together, and there we were on 42nd Street, and I was somewhat speechless because I had no idea what to say to this great man. So that was my meeting with one of the other people that George knew. He would talk a lot about some of these people that he did know in the movie business.
Yeah, that's the Costa Gavras film. You mentioned. I know when I interviewed George once in writing, he had told me that one of the things that he regretted that he was not more political when he was younger. He wasn't as involved in the civil rights movement. And I know he had mentioned that one of his friends was an actor named Roscoe Lee Brown, who was famously bald, and he had this almost handlebar kind of like sideburns and whatnot. Did George ever express strong political views? Did he, other than say civil rights, did he wish that he might have gotten more involved in protesting Vietnam? He did later end up in Lebanon and whatnot. So he obviously had some political inclinations. Tell me a bit about George and politics and his views.
Well, you're right about that. He said this several times, not only in interviews, but he said it to me in conversation on occasion, that I was about to say one of his regrets, but George himself never liked to speak in those terms about regret. But in any event, he said one of the things that he wished had been different in his life was that he would have been more involved in the civil rights movement that really burgeoned in the late 50s and early 60s. And I was involved in that at university, actually. I don't think that his politics dictated who he worked for. I think he was a speechwriter for a member of the House of Representatives for a while, and I don't think that was a job that he got because of his politics. He got the job because of his writing abilities.
And he was a Republican congressman, I believe, from Connecticut.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I think from Connecticut, if I'm correct. I know that I don't think he had party affiliations. His politics were really based on his values, which is, I think, respect for individuals, for the human experience and for human beings. His belief in free speech, his concerns about tendencies towards authoritarian or tyrannical type of rule, and he was concerned about such things developing, especially under George Bush in the United States. So his work in Lebanon was not political in the sense that he wasn't acting to advance any particular political or organization or political ideology. I think he was there to do what he could to diffuse the situation, to bring about better dialogue between the warring factions in Lebanon, and to be sensitive. I think he was very sensitive to individual suffering.
You mentioned in our first go round George's memorial service, which was, I guess, a couple of months after he died. I guess, it was in March, and you said
Yes.
about 100 people had come to it. Were they mostly people that were from his later years? Did he keep in contact with a lot of people like you over the decades, or was it, are you one of the rarities? What was George's, sort of makeup of his acquaintances? Were they, people that went back 40, 50 some years?
There were, I think there was one person who was there who knew him, I think, a little bit before I did, when George was in university. And then there was me. And then there were his family. His first wife, Lucy, as I knew her, was there with Rachel. But aside from that group, most of the people, almost all of them, as far as I knew, were really from his later years in poetry. And during these last 2 decades or so of his life, he was really active, I think, in, if you can call it, the poetry community. He was editing publications. He was connecting with poets. I think he was mentoring poets. He was sort of involved in fostering poetry. And there were a lot of people there. And stories I heard were all new to me, because that was not really part of my relationship with George, other than he would periodically talk about it. He would, but I never got a sense of the effect that he had on other people with respect to poetry that I got from the memorial when a lot of these people spoke. And they spoke with great affection and gratitude for the help that he'd given them.
Let's turn, I guess, to George's final years. I think in the first interview you had mentioned that you saw him like once in the last year or so, while he was ill. How often over, say, in this century, the last 15 years or so, did you encounter George? Was it, every year, every other year, or did you keep in touch via email, that kind of thing?
Occasionally by email, but usually over something quite specific, arranging something. I would see him every time I went to New York. And at the time, I guess starting around the year 2000, it was more frequent because my mother was then alive and living in New York, and I have a brother who lives in Connecticut. So I'd periodically go down there, and I would make sure every visit I would give George a call, and I'd come over. Usually he was a night person. I'd get over at about 10, 11, sometimes 11:30, 12. And then we talked for 5 or 6 hours, until the wee hours of the morning. Often it was dawn by the time I left. I'm trying to think. I have memories of certain specific combinations. So I must have been there at least 15, 20 times, I would think, from about the year 2000 to when he died. Although I think I'm trying to remember now, there might have been about 9 months, a year or so, between the last time I had been in New York and when I saw him in hospital when he was very ill, and that would have been in August of 2014.
In the last interview, you also had mentioned that the number one personal quality about George, you said, was like his great acceptance of things, of being open-minded. If you could think of any other qualities that might have defined George, say on a personal level. George didn't act one way with in public and another way in private, as far as I know. And I know when he told me some stories of working on television series and whatnot, he seemed to be very well. I remember he told me a story about working with Lorne Greene from Bonanza on a show back, I guess, in the late 80s or 90s, and how they both thought a TV script was terrible, and George was worried all weekend about how he was going to say the lines without looking foolish. And when he was in the makeup chair with Greene, Greene turned to him and said, and they as they were sitting there, they filmed it, and the television director was like, yeah, whatever, it worked. And so I know he seemed to have been well liked by most of his compatriots. I remember he did tell me, I think it was he did Psycho 3 or 4, or maybe
Psycho 2,
Psycho 2 it was, okay, yeah. And he said that was his worst movie experience, I think because of the director, although I don't remember the particulars or whatnot. Is there any other particular incident that you didn't recall in our first interview that maybe you could share?
Yeah, there was something I'm just thinking now that, when you mentioned some of the movies, in one of my conversations with George, when I was in New York, I was asking him what he had done recently. And he said one of his recent movies was No Mercy. It was a movie with Richard Gere and Kim Basinger.
Uh-huh.
And I remember saying, George, I saw that movie. I don't remember seeing you in it. And then he told me the character that he played. And I said, of course. I mean, I love that scene that he was in. And, I recognized George in that, and which he felt was very good, that he was effective. And then when I went and saw the movie again, because I wanted to go it, then when George came on, I definitely recognized him. But I was so into the action, so into the characters, that it just never occurred to me it was George. And in fact, George said to me, he said that was one of his abilities, that he could get so into a character, and each character being mostly different from other characters that he played in other movies or other TV shows, that people would lose sight of George Dickerson and only recall the characters, and that this played against him when it came to casting, because his name or his image would not be top of mind to a lot of the casting directors, because he was so different and lost himself in the roles that he played. That he didn't really have that persona. That was one instance. I think I did mention, I can't remember whether I mentioned or not in the last interview, or whether I thought about it afterwards. But I think it was with Farrah Fawcett, who he had a lot of gratitude for, because she saved the scene, his one major scene in a particular movie he was doing. He was, as I think that the Bonanza sort of incident that you told me about worked for him, I think primarily because of Lorne Greene. George was often critical of skills, often would have ways of perhaps doing a scene a little bit differently. He's a very bright, very creative guy. But sometimes it would get him in trouble. And I think just in sort of playing it over in my head when you were relating the story, I thought, George was undoubtedly right. Lorne Greene was undoubtedly right. Lorne Greene had the weight, and so would listen to him. The director would listen to him probably more than he might have listened to George. But that brings up a character of George's, which is something that would appear in every aspect of his life. He would, experience something. He would think about it. He would make up his mind about it, have an opinion about it, and then became fairly set. It's funny, I don't know, it sticks to mind. The one time that he came up and visited me in Toronto was in June of 1987, and he came with Suzanne and Erin, their daughter, who was then just, I think, about 2 years old. And he was driving up. And so we were talking on the phone. He wanted directions, and I started saying, okay, you go in, you take the thruway, you go through Buffalo, follow the signs to getting into Canada, and then take I was giving the roads. He said, no. This is the way I want you to give it to me. You tell me that, the street that comes up and the direction that I want to go. So you would say, come up to the Highway 403, go north on it, or something like that. He was very specific in how I would give him those directions. And I realized in many ways that that's what George was. In almost every aspect of his life, he would have his own ideas, his own way of doing things, and would pursue them that way. I haven't really thought about it much more deeply, but I do remember another time. I think I related part of this incident in the last interview. There was sort of a mini reunion, maybe about 10 years ago, from students at Woodstock, the school where George was teaching, where I met him. And that was up in Connecticut. There were maybe about 10 or 12 people there, and George wanted to go. But as you know, he had serious medical problems over the years, and one of which was a lot of back pain. And I remember him very gingerly getting in the car, putting a cushion there, and I was trying to drive, in a way that wouldn't jar him. But boy, it came to directions, I mean, I know how to get from point A to point B, and George knew how to get from point A to point B, but his way and my way were different. And he was quite insistent, although his way was wrong, and then he apologized. That's another thing about George. I don't think he was ever shy about admitting, if he had made a mistake or if he had inadvertently caused somebody some discomfort or pain or whatever, he would come out with it, and would apologize and sincerely. He was, in that sense, I guess this goes along with that aspect of him being a very tolerant human being, accepting of other people, and treating people with respect. I guess that probably is a stronger strain that went through him, and I think is one which I remember, and cherish more than any other aspect of his character.
I think it was Death Wish 4 was the film that he was in. Death Wish 4, that was the number 4. I think it was with Charles Bronson.
Yes. It was Death Wish 4. He played the sergeant who was pursuing, was it Kelsey? Was that the name of the...
I don't recall, but...
the character, and I remember his partner cop was the villain, was the crook.
Yeah. Did he ever talk to you about the screenplay he was doing of his time in Lebanon, The Fool's Errand it was called, or did you ever read it?
Yes, I read it. I read, I think, version 22. When I was in New York one time, he lent me a copy. I probably still have it, which had gone through many revisions. And I think I had read, actually, when I was at his place, an earlier version of it. So it had gone through a lot, because I remember there was some significant changes in the two screenplays. So he would talk about that. And what's interesting, just for me in reading the screenplay, was that what I was reading were really all the stories that he had told me about Lebanon over the years. Mm-hmm. Virtually all those stories or the major incidents in the screenplay were things that happened to him. And some of them were harrowing. It's just unbelievable what he experienced, I guess what the people of Lebanon were experiencing as well.
Finally, let's just end this, and I'll just ask you just if you have anything else in particular, whether it's any anecdote or any other final comments on George, and something we may have covered before that you wanted to go over again, or something new that may have come in, and then we'll just wrap up the interview. So.
Well, there's one thing, it may be rather trite, but for me it was significant, and it was not too many years ago when I was up in New York, and we started talking about poker. George used to play a lot of poker. I remember back in the 60s, we'd have home games. There was one home game at his place, and I remember he invited me to a game with friends of his, and one time I saw him playing in one of the coffee houses when I went down to see him. But this was stud poker that we played, and he played. And I remember we were sitting in his kitchen, where we always sat, and he said, "Ed, I can't understand this thing about and Hold'em. What are the small blinds and the big blinds?" He said, "I cannot get it." And he was really frustrated. When George didn't get something and understand it, it was really frustrating him. And he was very impatient about it. But I remember here what struck me about this, I said it's a rather trite, trivial kind of thing, was that it was, for me anyway, a reversal of roles, right? I mean, my relationship with George, I would just sort of soak in the things that he was saying, and I looked up to him and respected him, and I saw myself as almost in many ways like the acolyte, beforehand. And here I found myself teaching him, and then I tried to explain the blinds, and after 2 or 3 or 4 attempts, he finally got it, and wow, he just said, thank you, now I understand it. But it was bugging him. He was the kind of guy that wanted to explore things and go into them and get an answer. And I think for some things, maybe it would take him decades. I suspect that's when he finally came out of his writer's block, which he couldn't write poetry for more than 20 years after he came back from Lebanon.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the things that were bottled up inside of him and he was trying to understand came out in his poetry.
Okay, well, this will conclude the second of the interviews with Ed Shiller. I will be continuing this series, what I'm calling the George Dickerson Project. My next interview will be with people named Bill and Jaquetta Searle. They'll be talking about their memories of George and his family. So again, thank you, Ed, for this interview.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.